I think your experience with your dad really started you to think about that novel. I mean, maybe you could tell us about that, because
Okay.
that's very moving.
Okay. Before I began to write this particular book, which was maybe the 20th I'd written or the 25th, my father was getting old, and I went often to visit him, but this particular visit, I realized that he was starting to lose his memory, and in particular, he had forgotten my older sister. His first child was a daughter, 3 years older than I, and she had died young. I had written a book earlier about that experience, but at any rate, this particular time, visiting my father, I showed him a picture in a photograph album, and he smiled, and he said, "There you are with your sister," and then he suddenly said, "I can't remember her name." And I told him her name, and then he said, after a moment, "Whatever happened to her?" And I had to tell him about her death. And when I was driving my rental car back to the airport that day, I began to think about that, about what it would be like if we could somehow, magically perhaps, or through science, control people's memory so that they wouldn't have to remember the terrible things that had happened in their lives. And my father had forgotten the worst day of his life. Maybe that was a good thing. And of course, when a writer begins to think that way, what if this, what if that, then a story begins to take shape. And that was, by the time I got home, I realized the story I would next write would be about a group of people who had somehow found a way to manipulate human memory. Very quickly, I realized it had to be set in the future. This was 20 years ago that I was writing it. Oddly now, I've recently read articles that they have found ways to manipulate the memory in mice. And so, folks, this is soon to be coming to your neighborhood. So it's not perhaps that far in the future. But 20 years ago, I realized I'd have to write a book set in the future. I'd never been a reader of science fiction, but suddenly that's what I was writing, though I didn't put the science into it, because I don't know the science.